Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We will start at 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, so please set up your audio and video, and we will begin shortly. All right, it is 3 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us for a webinar from the National Association of EMS Educators. If you're a returning listener, welcome back. And if you're brand new to the NMZ webinar series, we're very glad that you joined us today. Before we get started, I'll fill you in on some of the controls available to you today. Attendees are in mute-only mode, but please submit your questions or comments by typing them in the chat panel or Q&A panel on your Zoom screen. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel and website following the presentation's conclusion. NMZ offers 1 hour of CAPC-approved CE credit for those who attend today's live webinar. There are a few steps to receive the CE certificate. I will send a link in the chat at the end of the presentation and include it in tomorrow's follow-up email. You must follow this link and register for your CE certificate on the NMZ website. NMZ members receive their certificate free of charge, and it is $25 for non-members. Today's webinar is titled Educating Culturally Competent EMS Providers, presented by Sahaj Khalsa, lead faculty at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. I'm going to pass it over now to our presenter. Sahaj, thank you so much for being here with us today to share your knowledge and experience with us, and we look forward to the presentation.
Thanks, Ria. Glad to be here. Here is really almost meaningless at this point, right? Because there's a bunch of us in various places, but we're all here. I'm looking around at the presenters, at the attendees, excuse me, and I can't actually see you, but it's nice to see a lot of old friends and new friends who are here for what I think is a really important conversation. And we're going to have hopefully a good conversation about what we can do as educators, as program directors or deans or whatever we are, to close existing gaps in disparities in care and in inequities in care. And so to start with, I'm going to ask you, if you can, put into the chat if you are involved in creating policy, if you're involved in interpreting policy, or if you have a role in your school where you work in interpreting policy for your students or your employees or whatever the case may be. So I'm seeing some yeses. Some people do have a role in policy. A whole bunch of yeses. Help creating policy, yes to all of the above. Great. So we're going to get back to that in a minute, and I appreciate everybody's responses there. I just have to share the picture that you're seeing on the background is my happy place. That is Ski Santa Fe. It's taken at about 10,075 feet at the top of our lift. And I share it because very few people recognize that that is actually in New Mexico. That's about 40 minutes from where I live, and is one of the main reasons why I live here, because I can get up into the mountains and do that. We're not actually all desert and cactus out here in New Mexico. So what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to talk about the scope of the challenge that we have in healthcare and that we have in EMS and in EMS education. We're going to hopefully understand the need for those who make policy, which based on the chat is most everybody here who responded, or who interpret or implement policy, the need to intervene to create change. And then we're going to discuss what we can do, what interventions can we do to make change. And you'll notice, if you're paying close attention, that there's a little bit of a difference between what this webinar was advertised as and what the title of this presentation is. And we're going to talk about why that is. So the webinar was titled Educating Culturally Competent EMS Providers. And I changed it a little bit to culturally aware. And to do that, I'm going to explain why that is. We're going to define some terms. And so cultural competence, as defined by a number of places, including a position paper that was written and published by NEMC a few years ago, is the ability of providers to effectively deliver care that meets social, cultural, and linguistic needs of patients. Contrast that with cultural humility, which is a process of inquisitiveness, self-reflection, critiquing, and lifelong learning. And I'm going to just talk about those two things for a minute. We are a very competence-driven profession, right? When we test our students, we aim for competence all the time. We want them to be competent in multiple domains of learning. We're pretty good at saying, yep, you reached this level. That's good. That's entry-level competence. And there is a message that carries along with that that says, okay, cool, learning can stop at that point. I don't think we really mean that message, but a lot of our students and learners pick up on that. And so in this realm, we have to recognize that our learning isn't going to stop. There's not going to come a time where we pat ourselves on the back, which is a strange phrase, by the way, because it's not easy to do, but where we celebrate a victory that we've learned everything there is to know about culture and about the different cultures that our patients and our coworkers and the other people we interact with have in their history, or that they exist within. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of places, including NEMC, moving towards cultural humility, which recognizes that there's not an endpoint in learning here, that learning has to continue. It has to be lifelong. It has to be career long for us to impact change. We're also going to talk about unconscious bias. We're going to talk a fair amount about unconscious bias. And so to define that, these are stereotypes about groups of people that we form outside of our own conscious awareness. We see people, we make judgments, we see things, we make judgments. And I'm going to submit to all of us that that's not actually inappropriate or problematic in and of itself. And I know that's potentially a little bit controversial, and I'm just going to hold that thought for a minute, and we'll talk about it more in a little bit. So remember, these are not actions. These are noticing differences, okay? And so we'll talk about that some more. So those are some important terms. And by the way, the title is cultural awareness that I'm using here because we want to make our students and ourselves more aware. We're not going to get to competence today, much to my chagrin and potentially to your chagrin as well, but we're going to hopefully increase awareness of the need for us to intervene as educators, as leaders in EMS, as policymakers or policy interpreters, okay? So what is the problem? Well, the problem is that research again and again and again has revealed worse care for minority or minoritized patients. And I'll define those terms in a minute. And when we look at it, these inequities, excuse me, in care hold true across the type of care they're receiving, whether it's acute or chronic care, whether it's emergent care or, preventative care. It also holds true in everything from ED visits to kidney transplants to high blood pressure management. And a lot of people say, well, maybe it's related to whether or not the patient has insurance or their education level or their socioeconomic status. And first of all, no, it's not. People who do statistical magic can control for those type of things. And what they found that when you control for insured status, for education, for socioeconomic status, the gaps don't change, they still exist. And so the fundamental bottom line here is I believe that all of us see those gaps, those inequities in care as unacceptable. And if we accept that A, they exist, which they do, and B, they're unacceptable, which they are, then we have work to do to close them. And so I think everybody understands what is meant by minority patients, right? There's racial minorities, there's ethnic minorities, religious minorities, all sorts of groups who are numerically less than the dominant group or the larger group of people. But minoritized is a different term that potentially isn't as widely understood. So what minoritized groups means, or minoritized patients, is patients who are treated as if they were a minority, even though they are numerically not. And the easiest example of that, unfortunately, is women who are taken care of in the healthcare environment. Women are there are numerically more women than men in the United States by about 52 to 48%. But women still are often treated worse in the healthcare setting. They have higher rates of death from AMI. They have less likelihood to get appropriate care. Their pain is less likely to be recognized and treated appropriately, even though they are numerically not the minority. So that's what I mean when I use the phrase minoritized or the word minoritized, okay? So let's look at some examples. This was a study of almost 1 million children who presented to an ED across the country with pain caused by appendicitis. And the standard of care for somebody in that setting is to have their pain managed, typically with opiates. And what the authors of this study did was they looked at whether or not there were gaps in care, whether minority patients, Black patients, Asian American, Hispanic, were treated less often with the standard of care. And the answer was they were, unfortunately. And again, almost 1 million patients in this study, and the inequities in care, the disparities in care held true once again when you control. And so we're talking under 18 that those gaps in care still exist, which again, I would submit that we all think is unacceptable and inappropriate. Here's another one. They looked here at female heart attack patients. I already mentioned there's some research that they have a higher mortality rate. Well, what these folks did, Greenwood and their team did, was look at what happens when a female provider is caring for a female patient who's having a heart attack. And what they found is that the gaps in mortality lessened. A female patient who was cared for, and it's not just docs, by the way, they looked at nurses and other healthcare providers. When a female patient having a heart attack was cared for by female caregivers, their mortality rate lessened and it became closer to that of the standard male patient. There's also another really interesting study that looked at this where they looked at race and concordance. And we know that African-American women who are giving birth have 2 to 3 times the mortality rate of white women who are giving birth. And those risks carry over to their children as well, their newborns. And when they are cared for by Black caregivers, that gap closes. Interestingly, in that study, what they looked at is if I, as a white guy, was taking care of a Black mother and child or a laboring mother, And I had previously worked with Black coworkers. That offered a protective effect. So we can look at that and say, well, a more diverse workforce, even if I, as a white person, am caring for a person of color, there is a carryover protective effect. And we'll look at that a little bit more in a bit here. And then a recent one, of course, is the impact of COVID-19 on racial and ethnic minorities in the United States. When we look at mortality rates, when we look at serious disease rates, those are way higher for ethnic and racial minority groups. We saw that the vaccine uptake was slower. And it's important for us to recognize that there is a distrust among some communities in the healthcare system and in healthcare providers. And further, it's important for us to recognize that that distrust is well-earned and well-deserved, right? We don't have to look that far back to see examples of healthcare professionals mistreating, systemically mistreating racial and ethnic minorities. The example that jumps to many people's heads immediately when we talk about this is the Tuskegee experiment, but it's far from the only example. Okay, there's many other examples where the distrust in healthcare has been established for generations and is well earned, which means we have a lot of work to do to bridge that gap. Now, you'll notice that none of the examples that I talked about or showed are EMS. And you're right. So people, I've been talking about this for years, and people would say, you know what, Sahaj, that's great. There's this evidence. It's horrifying. Of course, it's not actually great, but I understand there's evidence, but it's not in EMS. None of those examples are outside of the doors of the hospital or the clinic, and that's where we operate. So that's not us. And people would say, you know, it's not us, therefore we don't have a problem, therefore we don't have to do anything about it. Well, unfortunately, that's not actually true. It was true a number of years ago, but that has changed. And also, by the way, human tendency doesn't suddenly change when you leave a building and step outside, right? We leave the ED where we know there's disparities in care, and we get into an ambulance or we're in the pre-hospital environment, those disparities still exist. And this is just one example. There are multiple others of work that Dr. Bill Lord from Australia and I did. We looked at the influence of patient race on administration of analgesia by paramedic students who are in their internship. And we used FISDAP data to do this. And unfortunately, but unsurprisingly, we found significant gaps in care. So if you're not a statistical person like me, I didn't do the stats here. Bill Lord and his team down in Australia did, which thank goodness they did, because they can do it and me not so much. But what we can see here is what's called an adjusted odds ratio. And those two red arrows on your screen show that the adjusted odds ratio for an African-American patient receiving any analgesic, and by the way, in this study, that ranged from Tylenol to narcotics, to opiates. So any analgesia was 0.6. What that means in plain English was they were 60% as likely, alternatively 40% less likely to have their pain managed compared to a Caucasian patient. We can see a smaller gap, but still a gap here for Hispanic patients. And in the other areas, there was no gap. However, there were some other interesting findings. For example, women were slightly less likely to have their pain managed. And depending on their pain, obviously the likelihood of them receiving any analgesia went down. Now, an incidental finding here was This was 59,800 and some odd patients, so a large patient size here. Their median pain score was 7 out of 10, and only 14.1% of them, of that patient population with a median pain score of 7 out of 10, received any analgesia across all races and genders and ethnicities. The other piece that was interesting, there were multiple pieces, but the other piece that was interesting was when the injury was caused by domestic violence, only 1% of those patients had their pain managed in any way. So while the primary focus was on the racial and ethnic differences here, there were some other findings that I think we should look at and understand what's going on there. Now, many people would say this is one study, which is true, it is one study, but there have been other groups and teams that have done similar work on different timelines and using different databases, and they found very similar results. A researcher named Jamie Cannell out of Oregon, he did something very similar with a team up there using a different database, and if I remember correctly, his gap was around 32%. And there was another team that again used a third database, and they found a gap somewhere in the 30s, similar to what we found. So it's very hard at this point for us to say this doesn't apply to us. Okay, the evidence is pretty clear. So inevitably, the next question that gets asked when I have these conversations is, are you calling us racist? Are you saying, Sahaj, that EMS professionals are racist and therefore they are intentionally mistreating the patients who they see? And I want to be as clear as I possibly can, and I'm going to use my friend Grumpy Cat here to say no. 100% no, that is not what I'm saying. That's not what the evidence supports. And that's not the point, because that conversation points at an individual. What we need to look at is a broader systemic conversation. So then, if I'm not saying that we are individually racist, and by the way, let's be clear, there are some folks in our profession who do mistreat people based on race or gender or ethnicity or gender identity or sexual orientation or religion. Some people do that intentionally. They have no place in our profession, in my perspective. If an individual is intentionally mistreating patients, they shouldn't be here. And I'm not going to be able to be convinced otherwise, and I hope that's not a controversial perspective. So what am I saying? Well, here's what we know. There is an evolutionary basis for bias, meaning there is an evolutionary basis for us noticing difference, okay? We're not physically in a room together, but I'm going to use myself as an example. If I walked into a room with all 50 whatever of us who are here, you would notice that I don't look like our typical EMS person. I've got a turban, I've got a beard. I don't look like a typical public safety person. It's okay to notice that difference, right? It's not surprising to me that I've got a beard and a turban. I got plenty of mirrors, I see it every morning. The challenge is, the problem comes when we start acting on those biases. And when we look at primates, they notice difference. They notice if an individual is a part of their group or not. And it's actually evolutionarily protective for them to notice those differences, okay? We also note that intergroup biases exist in human infants, and throughout our lifetimes, humans notice difference. Excuse me. What's unique about humans that doesn't, to my knowledge, exist in primates is the ability and the capacity to discuss and overcome the biases that we have, okay? we notice difference, we can talk about it. We should talk about it. And then we can make sure, very consciously and intentionally make sure that when I get in the back of my truck and I'm taking care of a patient, or wherever I'm taking care of a patient, I don't bring my biases with me, or I don't act on my biases, okay? So another potentially controversial statement, which is, I believe we have to destigmatize bias. And let me be clear about what I'm talking about when I say that. That means that we have to destigmatize. We have to talk about the reality that we notice difference, okay? And there's an author who talked about this. He wrote a book about it called Everyday Bias, Identifying and Navigating Unconscious Judgment. His name's Howard Ross. And he said, listen, categorizing people without realizing it, which is bias, we categorize people, is as natural as breathing and allows us to navigate the world. We all do it. And if you don't believe me, I encourage you to take some tests on the topic, potentially have your students take some tests. If you're going to do this with what are called the implicit association tests, don't just send your student to the website to look at implicit association tests and take them. Instead, you've got to provide a box to put that in, some framework, some scaffolding, some education before they take them. These are tests, there's a bunch of them now, somewhere 20 odd of them, where you can, they were created by researchers at Harvard, and you can, have you sort. So let's say I'm looking at an implicit association test by race. They'll say, we want you to put all the non-white people on the left side of your screen. You're going to hit the S key when they come up. That's good. You're also going to hit the S key when good words come up, versus you're going to hit the K key for white people and bad things that come up. And they measure your reaction time, and then they switch them back and forth. And they will tell you as a result, hey, you have a no bias, a strong bias, a weak bias. And full disclosure, I took one of them. I've taken a number of them actually over the years. And it came back that I had I think the phrase was mild bias towards white people. And a guy who's been doing this for years, and I was like, what the hell? That's BS. It's not actually BS. It's just that we notice difference. There's some controversy over whether or not we can de-bias ourselves. And that's a little bit beyond our scope, but there's some discussion of exercises that we can do, and we actually advocate for some of them in a position paper, a consensus statement that we just put out, that we can do some things to de-bias ourselves. One of them is just interact with more people. So what we're talking about are systemic challenges. And if we try to fix systemic challenges on an individualized level, we're not going to be successful. So, excuse me, systemic challenges require systemic solutions. And by the way, everybody who said at the beginning, who answered yes to my questions, you helped create the system at your place of employment, at your school, at your department, whatever the case may be. So if we have a systemic challenge that requires systemic solutions, and you have a role in creating the system, doesn't take a lot of math to connect those dots, right? We all have a role in changing the system, in improving the system. So this is an educational podcast. It's not a podcast, webinar. That's what it's called. So what's the role of educators? And this holds true whether you're doing initial education, whether you're doing ongoing training, continuing education, whatever the case may be, whether you're at a college, whether you're at a department. We set the example. We set the baseline. We create what is acceptable and what is not. We have a direct impact on the profession. We are literally the grassroots of our profession. The people who come through our programs, who come through our training institutions, become what the profession of the future is. We help set policies, as we've already talked about, that may include or exclude certain groups of students. And finally, we're the gatekeepers to the profession. Somebody doesn't get through my program, it's a very small likelihood that they're going to end up in the profession. So if I have a policy that excludes people who, let's say, don't shave, that means if a Sikh kid or a Muslim kid or potentially a Black guy who can't shave because there are skin conditions that prevent 30 to 70% of Black men from being able to shave closely, they're preemptorily excluded from the profession just by a policy that it may be facially neutral, pun intended, facial hair, facially neutral, but it has a biased impact, okay? So we serve as gatekeepers to the profession. We determine what it looks like. So it's natural to ask, how are we doing on that front? Well, Dr. Remley Crow and her team at National Registry took a look at that. They took a look at how we are doing. They, in this study, examined female and minority racial or ethnic groups over 10 years who were entering the profession through National Registry certification. As you can see, they looked at a pretty big window, 10 years. Unsurprisingly, you can see in their table 1 results, and I strongly encourage you to read this, and there's been some follow-up work by Rebecca Cash and others that hasn't shown much difference, but what you can see in their results is females are underrepresented. Women are underrepresented in our profession. I mentioned earlier, roughly 52% of our population. You can see across the board from 28% to 35% of the new EMTs in that 10-year window were women. Compare that, bring that to paramedics. 21 to 23% of new paramedics were women. Now, I'm no mathlete, but I'm pretty sure both of those numbers are below 52. Okay. When we look at race, 78 to 73% of EMTs are white, and 87 to 81% of new paramedics are white. And when we look at the Black groups and the Hispanic groups, both EMTs and paramedics, nowhere do the minority groups match the population of the United States. And in this paper, they actually looked by geographical region. And there's no geographical region in the United States in this study where the representation of the workforce matches the population, okay? So what can we do about it? What can we as educators do to have a conversation to make change? What is our role in making change and in closing what I hope we can all agree is a clear problem that has to be addressed? So let's talk through some of the things we can do. In med schools, there's a lot of focus or a big conversation around what's called the hidden curriculum. So this is not explicit education, but it is pieces of education, it is comments that carry a strong message to your students. And it exists in EMS education as well. It's not exclusive to med school. We should be talking about this too. So some examples of it. Who's teaching? Who are the ones up in front of the class? There's very strong evidence that shows that a student, a minority student particularly, who sees a professional, an educator who looks like them, is more likely to believe that that profession is open to them, okay? There's also incredibly strong evidence going down very young that shows that when there is teacher-student racial concordance, discipline is lessened on the minority students. And this evidence goes down to pre-K, to like Head Start programs, where they're seeing minority kids as young as 4 years old are being treated inequitably by teachers. And again, that gap is closed if one of their teachers or some of their teachers looks like them. So who's teaching? There can also be stronger connections, similar backgrounds, similar lived experiences. So instructors can make a better connection, a stronger connection with their students. Scenario settings. Where do we send our students? Do we say, oh, you're going to a bad part of town and it's always a substance use issue? Which, by the way, we know that substance use is not isolated to certain communities. It's across the board. It happens just as well in the, quote, good part of town as it does in the bad part of town. When we send, and this doesn't just limit, isn't just limited to race. For example, when we send our students in a scenario to a nursing home, do we say some version of, well, the nurse isn't there, they don't know anything, they throw papers at you and they leave? And they say, I just got on shift, I don't know anything about this patient. Does that happen sometimes? Sure. But if we set up that scenario every time a student goes to a nursing home, we're sending a very clear message of what we think about nursing home staff and their competence and their ability to care for patients. Okay. Jokes and humor. Those of you who know me know I like to have fun in class. The research shows that learning happens better when we have fun, when there's humor involved. But what jokes are you making? Who is the target of your humor? Are we making fun of stereotypes, of students, of groups of people? Are we, as the saying goes, punching down as opposed to making jokes about ourselves or other people? So be very thoughtful of who you're, what humor you are using, who you are making the target of your humor, and make sure that it's not some group that is there's a power inequity and they can't push back, or that you're consistently stigmatizing a certain group of people with your jokes and your humor. And then finally, and these aren't the only 4 pieces of the hidden curriculum, there's a lot more, but these are some of them. Do you have a gap between your words and your actions? I would venture to say that if I asked you to put in the chat, if you have a non-discrimination statement in your handbook or your syllabus, most of you would say, yes, we do. Most of our programs at this point probably have some version of a non-discrimination statement. Is there a gap between the words of those statements and how we treat people in our classroom? Do we say everybody is welcome here and then make fun of a certain group of students? Do we, through our words and our actions, show that we actually don't mean it when we say everybody is welcome here? We mean this group of people is welcome here. And by the way, I promise you, your students pick up on those things. They are attuned to it. They are smart. They know these things exist, and they will pick up on if I say everybody is welcome here, and then I target a certain group of students to make it very clear that they're not actually welcome here. Another thing we can do, talk about it with your students. I've been talking about this with students for years, hundreds of students at this point. Not a single time has a student said, I had no idea there were challenges, there were problems with race and gender and ethnicity. Knock me over with a feather. Nobody has done that ever at this point. Instead, what the reaction is, I'm glad we're finally talking about this. I'm glad it's a point of conversation in this classroom, okay? And it's important for us to recognize that students' lived experience shows them, tells them that there are these issues. And when we don't talk about it in our classroom, we are undermining the truthfulness and the validity of what we're doing, because there is now a mismatch between what their lived experience is and what they're learning in school. Okay, so talk about it. And by the way, recognize that you're going to make mistakes when you talk about it. I've done it. You're going to do it. It's okay. As long as it's not malicious and you say, you know what, I apologize. Thank you for letting me know that what I said was inappropriate. I'm going to make sure I don't do it again. That's what people are looking for. They're not looking for us to be perfect right off the bat. Okay, so talk about it. Talk about it with your students. Talk about it with your faculty team. Talk about it with all the groups you work with. Examine your policies. Do you have policies that unintentionally exclude certain groups of people? The gentleman on the right is a lieutenant colonel in the US Army. I think he's actually been promoted now to full colonel. He's also an ER doc. He's deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. He's won a Silver Star. And many of us have policies that would prevent him from enrolling in our paramedic program. And by the way, to add irony to it, he's a medical director as well for an EMS system. The woman on the left is a Red Crescent, which is the version in the Islamic world of the Red Cross. She's a Red Crescent CPR instructor, and she teaches CPR. How many of us have policies that would exclude her from our program because her religious beliefs say I'm going to wear a hijab? So think about that. And by the way, I'm not here to tell you, I'm not here to argue that COVID isn't real. Of course, COVID is real. I know that we have to have respiratory protection. There are devices that provide greater protection on something like 100 times a factor of greater protection than an N95 mask. So are we going to provide those devices to our students? I would argue yes, but I don't make decisions for you. Okay. Also, think about how you're recruiting. Where are you recruiting? Who are you going to? Who are you talking to? If we keep recruiting the same way we've been recruiting for 30, 40 years, we're going to get the same results. So think about, how do you recruit creatively? How do you get outside your existing comfort zone for recruiting? It may take going to communities that you don't typically go to. There's great examples of departments and services across the country doing this. They've gone to churches to recruit. They've gone to block parties in portions of the city that they serve that they don't normally go to. In some cases, they've gone back to scenes and sites where they've had calls and bad calls and said, hey, if you want to help out the next time something like this occurs, come on over, we'll help train you. And as I said at the beginning, acknowledge that this is a lifetime commitment. I don't anticipate a moment where we're going to be able to say, yep, we're done, we're good, we got this. No more attention needs to be paid. So we may look like Woody here and looking at the work and go, boy, this is a lot of work. I've already got a full plate. I don't really have the time to do it. And I understand that. I'm a recovering program director for about 10 years. And I recognize the workload and I understand that. So let's talk about, if you're not in a place where you can make wholesale changes, cool. Make some small changes. These are some small things that are hugely important to making your students feel welcomed in your classroom. Learn your students' names. Learn how to pronounce them. Both of my daughters have unusual names, right? They're Sikh names, and both of them were made fun of by their teachers in class because one teacher said, my tongue can't make those sounds, so I'm going to call you something else. Another one called one of my younger daughter, she was 12 or 11 at the time, called her Popcorn. Now, as much of a fan as I am of popcorn, that's not my daughter's name. And the whole class busted up laughing at her in 6th grade because the teacher made it very clear that her name was unusual, was weird, and she did not feel welcome. I asked her what it felt like, and she said, I just didn't want to be there. Okay, so learn your students' names. Are you going to mess it up? Sure, fix it. Okay, acknowledge the mistake and fix it. Check in with your students. Check in with how they're doing. Make sure that they're feeling welcome. Open a path between their instructor or you and them where they feel comfortable coming forward and saying, here's an issue that I would like to be addressed. Okay, check in with them. Look at a class from the student's perspective to the best of your ability. Do we have material in there that is potentially sending a conflicting message to our policies of inclusivity? Ensure that you include all students in all aspects of your class. Don't say, you know what, we're going to do lifting and moving today, so the women students, why don't you go over there and we'll get the guys to do this, right? This is a hard work. We're going to lift stuff. So, hey, guys, step up here and do that. Look at your own assumptions. What do you assume? What do your biases tell you about certain people? Okay. And then establish and maintain ground rules and follow them. If you're going to say everybody's welcome in your classroom and we're not going to tolerate mistreatment, follow through on that. Mean it. Live it. Don't just say it. And then don't ask students to speak for a whole group of people. Don't say, hey, Sahaj, can you talk about Sikhs and how they should interact with EMS? Because, you know, you're a Sikh and there's 25 million Sikhs and you can speak on behalf of all of them. I can't. I can barely speak on behalf of myself half the time. Don't say to a student, hey, you're an Asian American student. Why don't you teach med math to everybody? Okay, so be careful about how we do that. Now, if you ask a student and they're willing to talk about their perspective that is maybe unique, cool. And I've done that a bunch of times to talk about my perspective on being a Sikh and EMS and other things, okay? But don't presume that they're going to be okay with doing that. There is a position paper about this that was written and released in 2019. It was written in 2018, released in 2019. And there are 6 recommendations here. And these recommendations basically are everybody should get and have equal access to EMS education and EMS care. And EMS educators, that's us, should acquire, utilize, and teach the ideals of cultural competence and humility. We need a diverse workforce. We need a more diverse workforce, and we help create that. And we also talk about employers, and I'll point out, by the way, that all of these align with Agenda 2050, okay? And this paper, by the way, is available. It's a what's it called? Open access paper, thanks to our friends at PUC. Now, I don't believe this is political, but I also recognize the reality of the environment we're in. And I have the privilege of being in a state and working in a state where I can talk and discuss this stuff very openly without fear of repercussions. Some of you may not be that lucky. You may not be living in a state where this is seen as non-political, and there may be potentially consequences if you do discuss it. So I'm just going to mention a couple of things that can help in that environment. Focus on the data. The data is very clear and hard to argue with, okay? Our agenda should be 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 10th, patient care, okay? Our agenda is patient care to make sure everybody gets the care that they need. I believe that everybody wants patients cared for, or at least the vast majority of people want the patients that we take care of to receive the appropriate care. And then share research as much as you can. And by the way, you need to know your environment. You know your environment way better than I do. If you're in a place where this is career threatening to have this conversation, I probably wouldn't in that setting. Maybe I would, I'm kind of ornery, I'm not sure. But do obviously use your best judgment in the environment that you are in. So, like my New Mexico yellow of this slide, and it carries over to the next one, what's the impact of a more diverse workforce in EMS? Well, we took a look at that in New Mexico. And what you can see is New Mexico is a majority minority state. We're a state that is 47% Hispanic, about 10% Native American. And when we look in EMS, 37% of our providers are Hispanic, which is better than the national average, but is still about 10 points below our state's population. And what we looked at here was the gap in pain management is closed. And you can see on table 1, for pain management, there was no gap in care for Hispanic patients in New Mexico. We're redoing this study with newer research. We did this a few years ago and with our friends at the Department of Health. They've been busy for the past couple of years and we haven't been able to get it to publication, but we are working on it as we speak because I think this is pretty impactful. And by the way, if you live in a part of the country in another place where you have a larger percentage of your providers are from a minority group, I want to talk to you because I want to do this with friends from around the country to see if it holds true in other areas. Because New Mexico is also unique in that we have been a Hispanic or Native American dominated culture for around 400 years. Okay, so we don't know, to be fair, that this is entirely due to a more diverse workforce, or if it is due to a culture that is more inclusive because of the uniqueness of it. And the answer is probably yes to all of the above, okay? So this is not comfortable. These conversations are hard. Again, you're gonna make mistakes. I've been talking about this and people have come up to me afterwards and said, hey, you used this phrase, that's offensive. I did not know that. Thank you very much for telling me, and I don't use those phrases anymore, okay? So you're gonna be outside of your comfort zone, but that's okay. Biological organisms grow, they respond when they're uncomfortable, right? So it's a prerequisite to growth. We're going to be a little uncomfortable having these conversations, but ultimately we're here to serve students and patients. And they're going to be more uncomfortable than we are if they don't get the care that they need. And so that has to be our bottom line, is we've got to take care of our the patients and the students who we are responsible for. These are the references to some of the sources I cited. If you want to email me, I would be happy to share those with you or to have a conversation about this. I encourage you, if nothing else, start talking about this stuff with your students, with your faculty, with your coworkers. If you're in the field and running calls, talk this through with the coworkers and the providers that you work with, and have these conversations. And if anybody has questions, you can drop them in the chat. I see there's one. I know we're just about out of time, but we've got just under 10 minutes for any questions. The question in the chat is, do you think that our student and employee population should mimic the diversity of the population as a whole, or should be reflective of the areas they serve? Trying to make sure I understand that question correctly. I think the answer is yes to both of them. Should they mimic the diversity of the population? Yeah, but I think the population probably in your area, right? So in New Mexico, it's not reasonable that the student and employee population would mimic the population in Alabama or California. It's a very different population. But when I look at my classrooms or my programs and my faculty who I'm working with, we should do our best to match the diversity of the area that we serve. And because I'm at the University of New Mexico, that's the entire state of New Mexico, okay? And we actually, as a school, we do a reasonably good job at doing that. Other questions? I know this is a challenging topic, but I think it's a critical one. So other questions, and I see somebody, Aaron Flynn is here from Manila, I believe. So thank you for joining us at what, 4 o'clock in the morning at this point. But other questions for the last few minutes here? Okay. Well, if there are no questions, thank you for your time and your attention. I believe I am happy, by the way, to have conversations offline. That's my email address. Please reach out. Please let me know if I can help or you have any conversations. And I'll point out there's a comment in the chat about calling out somebody's location. They put it in the chat, right? So they disclosed that as at the beginning, and I appreciate their attendance and I appreciate the concern. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. And Rio, I believe I turn it back over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sahaj, for being here with us today and for presenting on such an important topic. Everybody, just so you know, this webinar was recorded and will be on our YouTube channel shortly here. I put the link to obtain the CE in the chat, but there's no worries if you missed that because it will go out in tomorrow's follow-up email. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And I think that's everything, okay? So everybody have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.